City of Angels is a hub and definitely a cultural creator for our United States. All right. We are back for another installation of Haunted Canyon. And this is your indubitable host, Brandon. And in the house we have today my co-host, Lindsey.
Hey, guys.
What's up, Lindsey?
Oh, nothing much.
And BT, the mostest hostess. What's up, BT?
Not a whole lot. Just creeping around.
Creeping around. Yeah, creep around like that guy.
Like that CIA guy who's creeping around Laurel Canyon.
Yeah. That's right. Plastic People, Frank Zappa. If you're below 40, you probably don't know who Frank Zappa is. But yeah, he is important to this whole story. And we're just going to jump in what we have today. And kind of following the model we've been doing. You can't start this podcast here about the whole music scene and about the counterculture and CIA, sinister forces, and LSD and all that kind of stuff without setting it up. And I owe this to a book by David McGowan, which if you want more reading about what we're talking about, I suggest you pick it up. It's called Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon. And there's other books out there, you guys, that are about Laurel Canyon, and they're good, but they're just strictly facts and fact-oriented. This McGowan really goes into the dark places and a lot of the connections here. But I just think he starts his book out, and we should start this aspect of the podcast out with one of the most important setups that I want to talk about. We all know the Vietnam War. My father was serving during the Vietnam War. Lindsey, did yours serve during the Vietnam War?
During it, but he was a guard, and yeah, they didn't get sent over places back then, so
yeah. My dad was an MP. So, BT, your father served at all?
No, my dad was too. Anything? No, I came along too late there. My family just reached their 20s when the 1980s came along, and my grandfather was in the Korean War at the end of it, and I think he just flew helicopter.
That's cool
for Vietnam. Man.
Well, my dad can tell you stories of being at Fort Bragg and just the crazies coming back from Vietnam. But anyway, our story starts with Vietnam, and it starts with this place right around Vietnam called the Gulf of Tonkin, and it's been called a false flag, but I really don't think it is a false flag. I don't think it happened at all, to be honest with you. And yeah, I'm not going to dive really deep into it, but what I want you to get out of that is the fact that there was this guy named Admiral Morrison who was the instigator. It was on the ship who instigated the whole Gulf of Tonkin incident, which, interesting enough, people don't know this, but Vietnam was never a war. It was always a police action. Was never declared a war, which is anyway. So this Gulf of Tonkin event happened right in 1965. The interesting thing about this is on the other side in 1965, a movement started. And we know how movements operate. We've watched Christian movements, we've watched occultic movements, but a movement started, and this movement is definitely pretty sus. And we'll dive more into that. But the interesting thing is one of the primary movers and shakers of this movement is this Admiral Morrison's son, who we all know as
Jim Morrison.
Of Doors fame.
Of the Doors. That's right. And he goes from a schoolboy in a private school up in Arlington and preppy and all this kind of stuff. He leaves, grows his hair long. People believe he's always had an eating disorder, so he loses a lot of weight because he used to be called the chubby Navy brat, is what he was called.
Yeah.
And reinvented himself, and all of a sudden he's down on Love Street, and he is definitely rocking and rolling and setting all this off. Now, that's the irony there. That's the beginning of the ironies that I just wanted to set out there.
Mm.
What are the odds? I know when we deal with conspiracy type stuff, there's logical fallacies that we don't want to follow. I guess guilt by association sometimes can be entered in, and any other fallacies y'all can think of? I can't think of any right offhand.
No, I was just thinking about the fact that it was. This is just popped in my mind. Jim Morrison died young.
Yeah.
And 39 years after Jim Morrison died, his dad dies.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And he wasn't part of the 27 Club, was he? Yeah, he was. Well, he's in France. He's quote buried in France, and then there's another whole conspiracy about him, just like with Elvis, that he didn't really die, that he reinvented himself.
Yeah.
So, but anyway, sidebar. Anyway, it's speculation, and I do want to add a disclaimer here, to you guys: is all this stuff we're talking about, we can't empirically prove this, just like you can't empirically prove a lot of things. And so there's going to be some speculation. There's going to be some dabbling in different things, and all we want to do is just present some evidence and let you draw your own conclusions about all this. I mean,
very few
right,
smoking
guys?
guns here. Yeah,
there are some smoking guns. So, Lindsey, did you look it up?
No, Morrison was 27 when he died.
Jim was part of the 27 Club.
Yes,
you said
he was indeed 27 when he died.
Yeah,
Man.
and there was conspiracy swirling around him, but like BT had said earlier, that there's conspiracy swirling around all of them, from Michael Jackson to Elvis to Jim Morrison. Everybody doesn't want their star or celebrity to die, so it's kind of this weird phenomena. But anyway, so it's interesting that all this starts in '65. It's like the beginning of the beats. Some of the beats from New York City up in the Village are leaving New York City and coming out to a place called Laurel Canyon, and setting up shop out there in Laurel Canyon. But I do want to mention this before we get into some of the names. I'm gonna go through a lot of the names, and we could talk about the different names of just the sheer quote coincidence of their background, and we'll get to it in a second. But there was a base. Now it's owned by somebody else, which we'll get to in a later episode. A base up in the hills of Laurel Canyon where they recorded nuclear explosions. And when I say nuclear explosions, I'm doing quotes in the air, because we all know that it was more than just a studio about nuclear explosions. It was a propaganda hive. And when I say we all know, okay, well, I'm doing the speculation, but it's pretty, like most likely. So
was that the Nike missile base?
No,
I know there was one
in
Lookout Mountain
in the Santa Monica Mountains.
No, it's in Lookout Mountain. It's like
it's the Air Force Base at Lookout Mountain. Right. That was the one I talked about in the first episode that they used for commercials and movie production for the United States Army.
Yep, that's it. Yeah. The interesting thing is a lot of people don't realize this is the Air Force is not just about planes and the Air Force. It's kind of like the Space Force is now. One of the biggest things the Air Force does, and I'm assuming you two guys know this, is intelligence. I mean, it is the intelligence branch of the military.
No.
Other intelligence branches, it's real quick to be noted, are not military; they're civilian. Like the OSS, and then which morphed later into the CIA. And some of the other, like FBI, they're not military; they're civilian. So, anyway, the reason I'm talking about military intelligence, I'm talking about this base, I'm talking about all this stuff, is just all these coincidences, quinkydinks that line up, and I'm going to go through a list of people that we all know. Even kids, I think nowadays know some of these names because they're pretty important. That and they're in their connection to the intelligence community. it's baffling. It's going to blow your mind when we just go through all these different names. And we've already talked about Morrison being Admiral Morrison, is his son. But you have the mother of invention, the mother or the father of the countercultural movement,
Yeah.
which interestingly enough, I'll get into in a second. He didn't really want that title, but he
Yeah.
was it.
He had a complex relationship with that whole movement, we'll say.
Yeah, absolutely. Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention, but Frank Zappa, Frank and Gail. Um,
Man, yeah.
lots of military ties there. First on Frank's side, he had a military father, and then on Gail's side, Gail Zappa, her family was related to. I think it was she worked at Edgewood, and if
Mm,
anybody knows where Edgewood is known for its chemical warfare stuff, but it's also known for its LSD and MK Ultra
yeah.
stuff. This is documented. This is not speculation. Edgewood,
Didn't
a lot of this has come out. What is it? Fair use, not fair use. What is it called? When
declassified.
yeah, declassified. But there's another Freedom of Information Act type
Okay,
stuff.
for you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So definitely, there's some MK Ultra ties there. But Frank Zappa, who ended up living in the log cabin, which was it really wasn't a
Mhm.
log cabin. That's a misnomer. It was a mansion with a huge 20-foot living room, and but it was just basically became a big commune. Interestingly enough, we'll get into later on with the Manson episode. The family tried to infiltrate Zappa, because Charlie just wanted to be a rock star. I mean, he really did,
Right.
Yeah.
y'all. And so he tried to infiltrate Zappa, and they wouldn't let him in. It was
Yeah.
Tex and some other people. And Zappa, believe it or not, didn't want explicit heavy drugs like cocaine and LSD and all this kind of stuff
Mm,
in his orbit, which leads back to something really crazy about him. Is he, among all these other people we're going to get to, started the countercultural anti-war movement. Okay. But his politics, his worldview, his way of looking was very much not hippie anti-war movement. As a matter of fact, he hated the term hippie. He didn't like hippies. He'd rather call them anybody know
Freaks.
Bueller? Yeah, freaks. That's right. Yep. And so he called them freaks, and we'll get to that later on. But yeah, so Zappa he was the so-called king of Laurel Canyon initially in '65 in that area. Um, a next one, and this one you guys will blow you away. This is David Crosby, who is, well, number one, known for the Birds. He was in
yeah.
the Birds, and number two, part of Crosby, Stills and Nash, and then it was Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. The interesting thing about him with this is, of course, he's connected. People call him American royalty. I mean, he was related to signers of the Declaration of
Hmm.
Independence.
Yep. Founding
He was
fathers.
related to people in the Continental Congress. He was related to Revolutionary War heroes. He had all these political ties. He is what we would consider American royalty. And here he is, and he was also went to the same boarding schools that a lot of these people did in Arlington, and here he is starting a countercultural movement. Now, before I go in any further, uh, about this, because I want you guys to weigh in on this. A lot of naysayers will say, "Well, it's obvious they're all just teenagers and they're rebelling against their parents." But see,
Hmm.
here's the problem with that. Their parents, including Morrison, and as we go down the list, their parents did some really awful things.
Yeah.
And you don't hear a song coming out about protesting some of the things that these guys knew their parents did.
Yeah.
And so that makes it kind of sus, in my opinion. What do
Right.
you guys think?
Well, I mean, this is the countercultural evolution of the 60s, right? I mean, we're talking about a bunch of people that are anti-establishment before they're hippies,
Yes.
right? I mean, the hippie
Yes.
movement occurs almost parallel, but this is specifically an anti-war movement. And
Yes.
it's different. It's weird. It's strange because World War I hit America, World War II hit America, and you had a bunch of the patriots were all for the protection of democracy in the world, in the West specifically. Vietnam comes along
Yeah.
and it's brothers, uncles, best friends being pulled out, mandatory drafted to go to
Yep.
Vietnam and literally be killed because it was a meat grinding machine. There's no ands,
Meat
ifs,
grinder.
or buts about
Absolutely.
it. More people went to that war and died than both
Yep.
World War I and World War II combined for American soldiers.
Yep.
Mm.
Yep. Well, you know, and something too. I don't know if you guys know this. The song that came out that was like is the uh, anthem is the word I want to use for this countercultural movement that was beginning to be established was actually, interestingly enough, a song by Buffalo
Yeah.
Springfield. And anybody want to guess what song it is?
I can, yeah.
Yeah, there's something happening here. And the interesting thing about it, that song though, you guys, is a lot of people don't know this, is that song was not written to be an
Right.
anti-war anthem against it. It was there were some people down the Sunset Strips protesting this bar that they wanted to go
Right.
into, or
It's a
it's something
speakeasy.
similar to
Yeah.
that. It was it was a local thing, and Buffalo Springfield wrote this song, and it just fit perfect to be the anthem for this countercultural movement.
Yeah, we see it in
Yeah.
what movie is that? Forrest Gump. The helicopters are flying and the song's going. Something's
Yeah.
happening here. Now, every time that there's a Huey
Yep.
flying over, all you think about is something's happening here.
Yeah.
Yep. Yep. Well, and the other thing, let's go back to David Crosby. Interesting thing about this, because I want to talk about the Byrds, because they were the first superstars after the Beatles to come out of Laurel Canyon. They were the Laurel Canyon men. You know what's so fascinating about the Byrds is they were almost like the Monkees. And if you know who the Monkees are, they were a made for TV band.
Yeah.
They
They were a boy
weren't a
band.
real
Let's just
band.
call them what they were. They were a boy band.
Yeah, they were a boy band, but they were really, I mean, they took, I don't know if boy bands do this, but they had interviews to get the different guys in the Monkees. It wasn't like they were like New Kids on the Block. They all grew up together and
Mhm.
decided to do a boy band. I mean, the Monkees were auditioned for each one of them, from Mickey to Mike to Peter, and they were all auditioned for. But anyway, back to what I'm trying to say. The thing about the Byrds is none of them could play their instruments.
Mhm.
They had zero.
Yeah.
Seriously, they had zero experience
So
musically.
it's like Milli Vanilli in their voice, right? I mean, these guys couldn't sing, but
Yeah, there we
they
go.
could play instruments, huh?
Well, but that's what makes it so sus, guys. I mean, here we have a band that they're down at the Whiskey, or they're at the Troubadour, they're somewhere like that, and to hear them live is to hear like disharmony, and they just sucked
Mhm.
live. They did. But yet they came out with Mr. Tambourine Man, and it was a hit. I mean, it a major hit, and the Byrds went from practically overnight, you guys. They went from being,
Yeah, it was the Tambourine Man, and then Turn, Turn, Turn. I still hear Turn, Turn, Turn on oldies radio today.
Mhm. Yeah.
oh yeah, well, yeah, all of them. I mean, the Byrds, and they changed their sound later. But yeah, but they had no proficiency on those instruments, BT. There was no proficiency. And how is a group that has little to no proficiency on their instruments to going to be propelled to number one status in a few months?
Mhm.
They get to LA, they get to Laurel Canyon, and boom, they're the Beatles. I mean,
Mhm.
not the Beatles, but they're at one point in time,
Yeah.
guys, they were up there with the Beatles.
Yeah.
It's a new sound. They were trying to, the Beatles were waning down, and they were trying to rediscover themselves, which Laurel Canyon really affected the Beatles too. That sound later on, with
Well, yeah,
Sergeant
the
Pepper's
Byrds
and
got
Rubber
their
Soul and
start
stuff.
doing
But
covers of Beatles songs. That's what they did. They did acoustic versions up and down the strip.
yeah, yep. And anyway, but that's just suspicious. It would be like me waking up tomorrow and I'm playing like Steve Vai, and I've only been playing guitar for a year. And yeah, maybe that's a little bit of an embellishment or exaggeration, but it's almost reminds me of some past episodes where we talked about the crossroads of Robert Johnson and how Robert Johnson jumps in, can't play a lick, comes out and is the perennial blues man. I mean, if people say blues man, Robert Johnson's up there with like BB King, and but he couldn't play a lick of the guitar, guys. So that's just a little. I'll just leave that there. A little sinister force, just kind of. Let's push it back to the human level. What could the CIA have done with that? Well, we know that they have their hands in corporations. What the Tavistock, Rand, I mean, all that kind of stuff. Could the CIA have made the Byrds popular? I mean, I ask y'all, what do y'all think about that?
Wouldn't surprise me if they had something to gain out of it. Yeah.
Well, yeah,
if we follow
they did.
the trail of the establishment and the aim to influence society as a whole, I mean, then yes, we would just go ahead and assume, because they were doing it with Hollywood stars. That's a fact.
Yeah.
If they wanted you to buy a
Harkens
specific thing, specifically spray your children with DDT to keep the flies away, they were doing it by the United States Army intelligence, and they convinced tens of thousands of Americans to do things, buy things, listen to music. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, to the premise of the McGowan that I was talking about earlier, and I think I really do. I just I'm going to be subjective here, but I just feel in my intuition and gut that I think a lot of it's true. Is his whole premise is that this whole thing was a big psyop, that the CIA, while they were investigating with the occult, with the brain, with MK Ultra, they were also investigating on a corporate basis. Can we manipulate crowds? Which we all know that there is crowd psychology. I mean, there's a lot of it's come out since then and even before then. Can we manipulate groups of people to believe what we believe and naturally, with their free will, choose to be a part of this?
Yeah. And music is powerful.
Music is powerful. Every movement has had some sort of anthems or music. I mean, ranging from the Marxists to the Civil War to Russian Revolution to Christians, the Christian movement. We have our hymnology in our songs. Every movement has songs, because songs are powerful, because we memorize stuff with the songs.
Yep.
You know, I joke all the time, and y'all have heard me. I wish I knew my Bible as much as I knew gangster rap from the 80s. You know,
Right.
I mean, it's a sad fact, but when it's put to music, it's an earworm. It just gets in there, and yep. And so they knew the power of that, but they also knew the power of the culture that you can create around that. And I don't think it's ended. I think it's still been going on, but I think it started. And I think Laurel Canyon was the hub of this place. But let me go into more quote coincidences. All right, we already talked about David Crosby being American royalty, definitely military and possible CIA connections. John Phillips, he was one of the singers of the Mamas and the Papas, you know, along with Cass Elliot and his wife. Oh, I forget her name. Phillips.
I think
Michelle Phillips.
Yeah.
Yeah, Michelle Phillips, and then Denny. I forget Denny's last name, but they were the Mamas and the Papas. The interesting thing is that Cass Elliot and John Phillips, the story that they put out there is that that John Phillips met her waiting tables and you know, liked her voice, and then she supposedly hit her head and she was able to get higher octaves and all this kind of stuff. But reality is John Phillips didn't want her in the band because she was fat. I mean, that's just
Yeah.
reality. It didn't meet the image of it. But I mean, Michelle Phillips was hot and skinny
Yeah.
and all this stuff. And there's Mama Cass.
Right.
But Mama's Cass, I mean, her voice was amazing.
Mm-hmm.
See, when we bring it up the mamas and the papas, yeah. So something that I was going to bring up, since we've been talking about the mamas and the papas, anyways, John Phillips. But are you guys familiar with the 1/8 beats to a song?
Yes.
No,
Mm-hmm.
I'm not.
Idea. Well, okay, so we'll just take Mamas and Papas California Dreamin', right? And what they
Right.
employed in that is what's known as the 1/8 beat rhythm. And that's what adds to that catchy, memorable groove. But that's designed that unlocks something in the brain that activates a memory trigger. So basically what's happening is when a song's playing a 1/8 beat, it's activating in your brain to remember something specific. And so you're going to remember phrases from that song, and they're going to play over in your mind. And I mean, it's not like hidden secret messages. That's not what I'm talking about. But I am talking about the ideas of you buying or purchasing things that are going to be similarly related to commercials you might see with John Phillips or Mama Cass.
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah, I mean, what it does is it's a gateway to open to make your subconscious impressionable with it. I mean, let me tell you guys a secret. My parents grew up listening to this stuff, and I still love this music. I still do. And I remember listening to their first the Mamas and Papas first album on vinyl back in the 70s over and over and over on the record player, and I can still sing California Dreamin' just about word for word now in my almost 50s. And that's the earworm thing I'm talking about. And I think I've heard about that Beats thing because I think later on, which this is not the purview of our podcast, but later on, I think rap adapts that and uses that to sample.
Yeah.
That eight.
Yeah, it releases like dopamine into the brain, so you're getting pleasure, motivation feelings. They say that we were talking about LSD. People who are on hallucinogens listening to 1/8 beat music leads to a heightened sense of arousal and improved mood. And oddly enough, it engages their cognitive abilities at a higher level. So there's all sorts of things going on that's playing into. I mean, but that's the thing. That's the drug scene, right? I mean, we've got the big drugs kicking off at the time with LSD, shrooms, obviously marijuana, but whatever. But the thing at the end of the day is there's all these drugs going around, and people are smacking out 1/8 beat songs. I mean, that's not a coincidence.
Well, and see, and this is where I think I find it interesting, and frequency I think is important.
Absolutely,
to be involved in this kind of stuff. But I remember back during the Satanic Panic, they would say that rock music has this certain beat. It might be that 1/8 beat you're talking about. And that it's evil because it has that. And the reality is not evil. It can be used in Christian music and put gospel in there and have the same effect, a dopamine release about Jesus. So I get, but it just was discovered and used by the sinister forces before it was us, which is usual in Christianity.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, DNA. I mean, let's just follow a rabbit trail here as we're talking about frequency and DNA. So DNA is made up of adenine, thymine, cytosine, and guanine. These are the proteins that make up your DNA. And at a specific vibrational frequency, see, they used to think electricity is what worked basically in the DNA. So everything was electric, right? The electric universe and everything. Turns out it's frequency. So when you find yourself listening to music and you're just jiving and jamming and just rocking to what has happened is your DNA has tightened up and it begins to celebrate because it's squeezing out all of like the junk stuff that's not really part of your code. And that's all done by frequency,
like
toxic proteins basically that are in your body. And so you're just jamming and jiving to the song. And look, if I know about this just by a simple study, and I know that there's a CIA document on it, I'm going to go ahead and say that the things can be used to influence people to do what you want them to do.
Absolutely.
Just saying.
Absolutely. Well, let's pull back to John Phillips and the Mamas and the Papas. Interesting thing, John Phillips, before he was married to Michelle Phillips, married a Susie Adams. Yes, and when you hear the name Adams, yes, we're talking about that Adams, related to the president, John Adams. So she was royalty too. And yes, the other interesting thing is both his sister, Rosie, and Susie both worked at the Pentagon. So there's John Phillips. Not only was he raised a military brat, he had people on the inside in the Pentagon.
Yeah.
Then we move on to Stephen Seals, who is he's an interesting character. He's kind of one of my favorites in the Laurel Canyon thing. But the song Bluebird that he wrote was actually the initial name for the MK Ultra program. It was Project Bluebird, and then they changed it. So, coincidence? I don't know. He also had a military family. Mama Cass Elliott of Mamas and Papas. She went to the same school as Jim Morrison, John Phillips. I mean, all these guys out east, when they were younger, the same prep schools. Military background, America, which is really crazy. Just knowing their music and a lot of that stuff. Military, all of them had military parents and family. Mike Nesmith, who, interestingly enough, this just blows me away, was worth like $25 million back then. I mean, it just blows me away how much money that is. And supposedly he received an inheritance of $25 million. Him and Corey Wells of Three Dog Night, they both were in the Air Force, which, like I talked about earlier, the Air Force is not about flying planes, even though planes are flown in the Air Force. The Air Force is about intelligence. It's the intelligence branch of one of them, of the military. And this is a big one. This really shocked me. And there's tons of these, you guys. I'm just hitting the big stars, okay? Jimi Hendrix was in the U.S. Army. Anybody want to guess what he was in the U.S. Army?
He was 101st Airborne. Yeah.
Yep, 101st Airborne. You guys, if you know anything about the Army, anything about the military, I mean, that's elite. He was an elite soldier.
Yeah. If you've seen Band of Brothers, that was those guys.
Yes, he was a sharpshooter too, y'all. He was a sniper. And supposedly he got discharged, but nobody really knows why. There's rumors that he pretended like he was gay and got discharged, or that he was young. I don't know if y'all remember MASH. Y'all might be too young, but Klinger or something like that. I don't know. Today it'd be fine. It'd be all good. He couldn't get out. But anyway, he was discharged. Now I don't know if it was honorable or dishonorable, but he was discharged. Next thing you know, he's playing with a band, and next thing you know, Jimi Hendrix is on top of the world.
Yeah, man.
Goes from, the 101st Airborne to he's on top of the world. And he's an amazing guitar player, but he's definitely an overrated guitar player. I'm just going to be honest with you. I mean, that's my opinion, and I'm going to I'll hear more complaints about this podcast by saying that than anything else I said. You watch.
He's like, Jimmy's just bland.
Jimi Hendrix.
Jimmy couldn't string a guitar, but he could strum.
Yeah. Anyway, but even then, and then you look through that list and look at see how many of them were in the 27 Club, and one of you guys break down what is the 27 Club?
It's this just very suspicious sort of phenomena, if you will, that a lot of famous, usually musicians, actors as well, die at 27. Going back to Robert, I've forgotten his name already. The blues guy you talked about earlier.
Robert Johnson.
Robert Johnson. Yeah. Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Jim Morris, Kurt Cobain, and the recent one was Amy Winehouse.
A lot of these within 2 years. Yeah.
What Lindsay
I was just saying
again?
a lot of these from like 69 to 70, You had a lot of them packed into that time period, or maybe 71, but it was a very short period of time where Blind Al Wilson, he doesn't get talked about a lot. He was the lead singer and
Yeah.
guitarist for Canned Heat, and a really eccentric guy. He died at, well, was he 27? Yeah, I think he was 27 when he died. Yeah. So, yeah, it's just weird. It's just a weird thing.
It's a weird phenomenon, and it's definitely a deep dive. And we all know, you guys, how the elites and the people we're actually really talking about. Well, we were saying the CIA, but we're talking, bigger than.
But Robert Johnson was the blues guy who met the dark man at the crossroads and could suddenly learn how to play guitar.
Yep.
So I wouldn't really
Scratch.
I wouldn't put him up against, it was the CIA. I would specifically say that's sinister forces, man, that claimed his soul.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, obviously the whole thing is sinister forces because even the elites with their CIA glove, they're still going by all these numbers are significant. 33, 27,
right.
And there's this new phenomena which I'm kind of chasing a rabbit here. I'll have to shoot in a second, but when these female pop stars reach 33, it's like this initiation type thing where they all go freaking crazy nuts. They shave their heads and do weird stuff. And I mean, Brittany, Lindsey, Lohan, I mean, a whole list of them. So anyway, back to kill that rabbit, but back to what we're talking about. Yeah. It's obvious that we're making a connection here and we want to do this because I think it's accurate. We did this with our first episode. There is a connection between the CIA and their influence with their psyops and stuff and these sinister forces. And I think that goes back to World War II. I mean, obviously it goes back further, but it goes back to Operation Paperclip and a lot of the Nazis over and how the Nazis enmeshed occult stuff with their scientific studies.
Yeah.
Right? And so all we did is move them over here, and we did the same thing with the OSS, which became the CIA. So, yeah, ultimately, I give you cred, BT. It's all about the sinister forces, and we have to remember that we don't wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, powers, and all the rest. But what I want to show through this is I think this is interesting about this psyop is the Hegelian dialectic. But I've kind of taken it. I did some research on it, and I've kind of taken it how it's been used in more modern terms. What basically happens is you have a problem, and then you have a reaction to the problem, and then the people who created the problem come up with the solution.
Yep.
And you see that with I call them the MIC, which is the military industrial complex. I mean, you have Eisenhower later on talking about the president talking about the power of the military industrial complex, which is, just grown bigger and bigger.
A warning that fell on deaf ears.
Yeah. Which is connected with the CIA, obviously, clandestine type thing. So what was the problem we created? We created the Vietnam War. I mean, it's like I said, it wasn't a false flag because it never happened. And at least that's what most conspiracies believe, that it was just a knockoff. It was just a story invented whole cloth. I don't know how true that is, but that's what it is. Okay, so what's the reaction to this? Well, the countercultural movement, the freaks and the hippies. And so what's the solution? Mobilization of the military industrial complex. That's the solution. So we have that whole dialectic going on here, which I think was inspired by, obviously, sinister forces. I think going back to Gen 6, going back to before Noah, I don't think that a lot of these dark angels or these dark forces have quit doing experiments on humanity.
Yeah.
I think they've toyed with DNA. Now they're just using human gloves, so to speak, human beings, to continue to experiment on humanity with all this stuff. It's like we're a big petri dish. And that's what the CIA created because of these sinister forces. They created a petri dish. They said, "Can we change a whole generation?" And let me ask you guys. I mean, we're all Gen Xers. Can you change a generation? Were our parents, the boomers, changed because of this music and all this?
Well, there's some really good photos of my mom wearing the puka shell necklaces, and I mean, she was pretty much a flower child.
Yeah. Well, and my dad very much wasn't, but that's part of it too. He was part of the reaction to the flower children. He was all for that military industrial complex
Right.
if it would knock those hippies in the head and make
Yeah.
them shut their mouth. I mean, yeah, he was very much, and he was probably in the majority of the country there
Right.
of kids
Yeah, yeah.
in the boomer generation. Most of them were probably against it, and that mobilized them against it in a lot of ways. So yeah.
It was real
But
interesting.
what's amazing and I'll say this with my family is I would say that my family probably was against it. I mean, my dad was in the military. He was drafted. He was a military policeman. But yet, me growing up, my mother very much, I wouldn't call her a hippie. She wasn't a flower child or any of that kind of stuff. But as far as music, I know all this music because I grew up listening to it. My mother every Saturday morning would clean house and she put on vinyl, and I heard Al Green, I heard Marvin Gaye, I heard Mamas and the Papas, I heard Blood, Sweat and Tears, I heard Love, I heard Vanilla Fudge, and they were more Motown oriented, but that
Hmm.
still was part of the countercultural on the African American side, which
Yep.
that would be another whole podcast.
Man. Yeah, that's a lot of music to listen to. You definitely weren't no fortunate son.
No, I mean it. I mean, she enwrapped me in all this stuff, and that was all hippie stuff. But she wouldn't claim
Yeah.
to be one. But it still influenced her and influenced that generation in ways that we probably won't ever know until till later on. But I see that I saw that dialectic, um, that matter of creating chaos, and then out of the chaos, trying to reconstruct something out of the created chaos.
Yeah. Powers that be, help us from this chaos. Oh, sure.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Well, I want to run into a few other things. We still need to cover the occult aspect. Go back to, we want to bring this back to the sinister forces.
Right.
But before that, I have to mention a man who is super overlooked and
Hmm.
underestimated, but was super duper influential in the conversation, and it's Vito Palakas,
Yeah. This
Armenian.
guy was really fascinating to me. I'd heard if I didn't know much about all these people, I'd at least heard their names before. This guy was brand new for me looking into this.
Yeah, and what's so crazy is that he was very much behind the scenes, and he's the one that created this.
Hmm.
And McGowan goes into his book a lot deeper than I'm going to go now about his background and his relations and who he had relationships with, some Rockefellers and stuff like that through different and an actress. I think her last name was Sears. Anyway, I just feel free to do your own research on that. But what I want to bring about Vito and the Freaks is what they came to be known as, is they were, you've heard in the political arena of
Right.
kingmakers. Well, Vito Velikas and the Freaks were star makers. And what they would do, and this is just basic movement or basic group psychology. The Birds would play at the Whiskey, which is a bar down on the Sunset Strip. If you don't know, it's a Whiskey a Go Go. It's super famous, and it's been like the hub. It and the Troubadour have been like the hubs of different like movements of music, which we'll get into some more of that in another podcast, more modern day stuff. But the Birds would come in and play, and Vito would send his girls, the Freaks, and these were the hippies. This is where
Hmm.
hippiedom came from. They dressed in all the weird stuff. They dressed in the provocative clothes. They danced really goofy and funny, and because half of them were freaking either stoned off pot or LSD, probably. But they would get out there and dance, and everybody's like, it would create a momentum, so to speak, in the bar, even if the guys behind there playing the music sucked. These freaks, because they were all young, underage, they were beautiful, and honestly, the interesting thing, and I want to draw a parallel here, Vito was Charlie before Charlie came along.
As soon as you said sent his girls, I thought about that's what Charlie was always doing, sending his girls to go rob houses, seduce people, steal things. I mean, yeah, he was always sending his girls to do things.
Well,
murder people.
And that'll get to a guy that when we get into the occult aspect of David Berg, the Children of God, and that whole cult, he sent his girls in too. They were hookers for Jesus.
Flirty fishing.
I know there are people listening to this podcast right now. You're like, oh my gee, I mean, what is that? Hookers for Jesus? Yeah, it was a real thing, you guys, back in the 60s, and but yeah, there was this really interesting phenomena, but a lot of McGowan really drew it out, and I really agree with it that there was that Vito was the precursor to the Manson to Charlie coming in and take. Of course, Vito by no means was as violent and everything. We'll get into that when we get into the Manson episode, but the freaks, that's what they were called, and that I don't know where the hippie term came from, but then they began to be called hippies because then they began to influence. But their basic goal was to go into these clubs with these bands that have been chosen, because it's really amazing, these bands that we're all talking about. They're not bands that like the Beatles, who went to Germany and were together for years and practiced and reached their 10,000 hours. Even though there is some conspiracies about the Beatles and stuff too, which I don't know if I believe. I mean, that's speculation. But they weren't guys that had done their 10,000 hours of mastery of their stuff. These were guys that just barely got thrown together, and some of them were good musicians. I'm not taking away from it, but most of them were just nominal. And now they started attracting good musicians later on, like Jackson Browne and Joni Mitchell and Carole King, Linda Ronstadt, other people. When it became the place, but initially it was just these musicians that they wanted to hype up and put out there, and then they could influence the culture or this movement with these groups, the Doors, the Byrds, stuff like that. The Doors were amazing musicians. People will argue with me about that. Now, Jim Morrison could write because he was a poet before he was, a songwriter. I mean, I have a book of his poems, and they're pretty amazing. He's a good writer. I don't like the content of a lot of it, but he really got the Dionysian spirit of his Nietzschean philosophy that he imbibed, and his poetry really reflected that. But the whole point of all this, though, is that Vito and the freaks were sent to be groupies.
Yeah.
And wherever they went, everybody else went. I mean, it's like ladies' night at a bar. You know why they make ladies' night at a bar? Because if you get ladies in there for free drinks, who's going to come?
And who's going to end up buying drinks also for the ladies?
Exactly. Dudes. And so that's the whole premise of what I'm getting. Is sex sells. It has sold, and it will continue to sell. And that was part of the whole thing with Vito and the Freaks. And who knows his connections or how he was connected to the countercultural movement. All I know is that, and it seems quite obvious that he was definitely handled by something because of just the sheer nature of what he did.
Well, and Zappa and the Mother's first album was Freak Out. And that's what this was. When you would go into one of these bars, you would go into one of these clubs, scenes, whatever it was, the action going in was known as to do a freak out. Yeah, they were freaks, and they went in the freak out.
Zappa hated all this, though. That's another fascinating fact. Zappa could not stand the hippie movement or all this, and it makes you wonder. So Is he some kind of a plant in with the MIC, the military industrial
Yeah.
Right.
complex?
For him to do his album like that.
It's just it's just crazy stuff, y'all. But we can't wrap up this podcast without getting to the foundation of all this and what BT started with his podcast, and Lindsay's going to get into, like I'm about to, kind of spreading out or fleshing out, I guess is a better word, of what we're talking about with these sinister forces that started back in the 40s and 50s. Started even probably further back. What was the name of the Tonga tribe that was in Laurel Canyon? Was
Right.
it the Tonga
The
tribe?
Tonga.
Tongva.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Tongva tribe. Yeah, the Tongva tribe. So, Sandy and I, just to do a little experiment, I'll share this with y'all. We looked up the ley lines, and there is a ley line that runs through Laurel Canyon, but it runs through, Los Angeles as well. But interestingly enough, and I find this fascinating because there's this real typology of these stars, these rock stars, these musicians. They get disgruntled and they go to the wilderness, and there is a huge hub of ley lines in Arizona in the wilderness, which is where
Our boy.
where
Jack
what's all
Parson,
out
L.
there.
Ron Hubbard.
Yep.
Burning Man.
Burning Man's there.
I mean, how many things?
The crash of Roswell.
How many things? How many things? Yeah, are out in the desert in Arizona, out there, and I find it interesting. I think it was Jim Morrison did some kind of a vision quest out there
Yep.
in that desert. So it makes me wonder. Even though the ley lines hub is not in Los Angeles like you would think, but it's definitely influenced because it's so close to the center of the hub. And now, what ley lines are, I'll let BT kind of dive into that a little bit more, and whether they're really real or not, or if they're just an invented kind of thing. But what are ley lines, BT? Give us a kind of a
So
description
ley
of what that
lines
means in the occult world.
Yeah, you got it. So ley lines spelled Ley lines.
Yeah.
They're basically, in my opinion, I think they're a hypothetical alignment of ancient sites. But basically, you have these lines that line up specific like ancient sites that were power hubs. I talk about locus of power. They're basically sites that are established where they have some kind of massive otherworldly activity going on, real heavy, and then they're connected via some kind of telephone line, a ley line. And so they basically connect these historical or geographical areas of importance. And as far as I know, the other term is also dragon lines. You'll hear that a lot when you talk to people.
Never heard that.
Yeah, basically they're just, dragon lines, and they're pretty much interconnected telecommunication line between powerful sites, say like the pyramids at Giza, Stonehenge, what may have been in California, Los Angeles area. I mean, there's all sorts of possibilities and probabilities as far as I can tell, because the Tongva people in the area where we call Laurel Canyon considered that a holy and sacred site where the gods dwelled.
Right. And they did dwell later. The celebrities are like in our culture.
They have been raised to godhood.
Like
God.
Yeah.
I do find it interesting too that a lot of spiritual warfare stuff that I've read or heard, they talk about the demonic world. Of course, this is all speculative because we can't go straight to Bible verses. We can extrapolate that there are like you said, communication lines, supply lines, all the military type things in the second dimension, possibly being thin places in the world. And I want to bring up this aspect too, but this is not only a bad thing, because the Irish or the Celts, the early church in Ireland, with think Patrick, think Columba, think St. Brendan.
Sure.
These guys understood thin places, which goes back to Eden, which is the Mount of God, where the second heaven
Right.
and our reality were blended so much that they were interchangeable. They lived together in coexistence, which is what God created us to do. We talked about that in BT's episode about Genesis, going back to the beginning of that. And even now, they're what Christians would call thin spaces or portals. I mean,
Mhm.
if you don't like that language, a lot of people think that's loaded with New Age language, but it's similar to that type of stuff. And but like most things in this fallen world, they've been co-opted for evil as well. Uh, and that would be, I wouldn't say ley lines are evil. I would say ley lines can be used for evil. Just like you could possibly, I don't know, BT, you can come in on
Yeah.
this and shoot me down. I don't know enough about it, but you could possibly make the case that these supernatural hot spots could be used for good as well. What do you think about that?
Well, I'll
Or have
take
they just been
no.
pretty much commandeered or
So
go ahead.
I call it flag planting. Right. The first massive flag planting against the demonic world I put as the transfiguration of Jesus on Mount Hermon. That's the first flag plant
Interesting
done by the
story. Yep.
by the
Mhm.
this new God bringing his back down to earth and bringing his kingdom to earth basically. And so Jesus plants his first
So
flag
what do you think?
there on Mount Hermon.
Is that Mount Hermon? Is that Mount Hermon,
That's
BT?
what
Do you think it
that's what
is?
I think it is. I don't find it's Mount Tabor, which is the commonly held tradition, because Tabor's
Yeah.
too far away
Yeah.
from Caesarea Philippi, and it doesn't make any sense, right? I mean,
Mhm.
Yeah. Okay.
it just doesn't seem to make sense from the biblical context. Uh, so the small T tradition is it's on Mount Tabor. I don't buy it. But
Interesting.
anyways, that's that first big flag planting, right? I mean, we had a massive flag planting in Jerusalem. That's what happens early on with
Mhm.
Abraham and the binding of Isaac. So that's a flag planting, right? We're taking places back. God's taking places back. Well, I believe the Christian church has picked up on that. The good guys have picked up on that, and they started building large churches over the sites of pagan places of demonic worship, taking places
Mhm.
back on the planet for God. And that may be
Yeah.
exactly the point that we need to be doing is, you know, look, I tell people, I says, look, the spirits when they were created, Brandon, they were created in timelessness and spacelessness, right? They're created. The spirits are
Yeah.
there. And when they fell, I don't care. It doesn't matter. But they fell, right? Some of them did. Birds, fish, the fish were created in the water. That's why they can't live in the air. Birds are created in the air. That's why they can't live in the water. Trees, you pull a tree up out of the ground because they were made to come out of the ground. You pull a tree out of the ground, what happens? It dies. But man
Right.
was made by the hands of God with the breath of God blown into him. And so that's what seems to be the reason why we don't feel like this is our forever home. And it's always,
Yeah, we live in two
we live in
realities.
two realities. And I really honestly believe that's why the sinister forces specifically attack humans. You don't see them really going after your trees, your birds. I mean, they may use these things to get to you, but the ultimate goal
Yeah,
is to
familiar
pull
type
you out of
spirits.
the family of
Mhm.
God and away from your family, your heavenly family. And so technically, we are a place of power.
Well, and I think that is a lot of the resentment that the elder brothers possibly could have against
Mhm.
us is the fact that we are versatile enough to live in two worlds, and they can't. They yearn for flesh, and without I don't want to chase this rabbit too much
Yeah.
further, but the whole Gen 6, they yearned to be like us, and even the Bible indicates that angels have always wanted. We're a mystery to them,
Yeah.
we're an enigma to them. What is it like to be human, and all that kind of stuff. But let me pull this back. I want to say a quote that I think
Yeah.
is really important to take into our next little round here, because this plane is needing to land, and we still got some stuff to cover here. Everyone in Laurel Canyon, says Sammy Davis Jr., had either been in Satanism or, like myself, had dabbled around the edge for the sexual kicks of it. And he made that statement talking about the victims on Cielo Drive, which we'll get into in another podcast. 10050 Cielo Drive, which is where the La Bianca Sharon Tate murders happen from the family. But before we get into that later on in another podcast, we need to set the foundations for in this movement we're talking. It's not like you said earlier, BT, just the CIA. It's the forces behind the CIA that are giving the CIA this empowerment to be able to dabble science with the occult, which is not new. I mean, alchemy's been around for thousands of years, and that is an engagement of science. And I really shocked somebody the other day. I looked at him and I said, look, alchemy back a long time ago was occultic, but they didn't consider it occultic. I mean, a lot of your Christian scientists used alchemy. They didn't see that it was an occultic type thing, like Sir Isaac Newton or
exactly. The word
other people like
chemistry
that.
comes from kemet. That's Egypt, and then alchemy basically was the same. It was the Middle East, so Allah, chemi, so it belongs to Allah, and it's kemet. Yep. Those are the etymologies of those words.
Well, before we get started, I want to start with just the occult influences, and one of the biggest occult influences in Laurel Canyon, and his hands were in everything. In all this stuff is Kenneth Anger. Yeah. Lindsey, tell us about Kenneth Anger. I think you have some knowledge about him.
Well, yeah, he directed short films and was just kind of openly a Satanist. Included in one of his films was Bobby Beausoleil, who come up in the Manson one. He played I want to say the Antichrist in one of his films, but he's just this really kind of very like openly into very dark occult things.
Not like Anton LaVey, who's a poser.
No,
but
Anton LaVey.
Anger was the real deal.
He was a true believer.
He might be considered a dabbler, but he was a true believer, not a scam artist. Like I think Anton was. But who? Anybody want to guess what band did the soundtrack for a lot of Anger stuff? Was very entrenched in it. Anybody want to take a guess? The Rolling Stones.
Yeah.
Mick Jagger and all the Rolling Stones went through a satanic phase. I mean, obviously,
it's one of their Page. Album titles. I mean,
well, and look at Sympathy for Who? One of their most famous songs, Sympathy for the Devil. I mean, but they did the soundtrack for some of Anger's stuff. Lucifer Rising, right? They did most of the but they were heavily into the occult and all that kind of stuff. A lot of people don't realize that. Now, I don't know if they still are or what, but back in those early days in the canyon, and their influence in the canyon satanically influenced all these other stars too. But it was just kind of kept on the DL with these other stars because they had to be the face, the movement. But it was everywhere, and then it really came in after Vito left, and the next charismatic womanizer moved into the picture, which is Charlie, which we'll get into. Mm-hmm. But another interesting fact, Brian Jones of the Rolling Stones is part of the 27 Club. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, it's just amazing. Another connection of Laurel Canyon with the 27 Club. But, the Stones were very much mixed into the occult, and they permeated it through the whole music era and even the celebrity era. There was a guy named Donald Cammell who was connected with Kenneth Anger, who they called him Osiris, interestingly enough. But I'm using guilt by association, so if this is a fallacy, forgive me. But he was connected to the godfather of all occultism, who had pretty much wrapped his career down, Mr. Crowley himself. So,
well, we speak of Crowley, we can't not talk about Jimmy Page, because Jimmy Page was also part of Kenneth Anger.
Yes.
in his music
Led
group, and
Zeppelin.
Jimmy
Yep.
Page ultimately bought the Boleskine house that was massively
Crowley's
used,
house.
for
Yep.
events of the occult power.
Yeah. And see, and that's something too, and you might need to touch on that. I know we're really going here, but you might need to touch on that, BT, about powerful places of the cult where things have happened and traumas and stuff, and how that feeds to a cult. Isn't it,
Well,
that house is actually on Loch Ness,
right.
right? Isn't it
It
on
is
Loch
on Loch
Ness?
Ness.
Mm.
Well,
Yeah.
I honestly think that a lot of these places of power are placed against massive power areas of water. It just seems to be a connection. I don't explore that well enough to really have a expert
Well,
opinion on the
that sounds
idea,
like
but there's something with the water.
water spirits or
Yeah,
marine spirits.
elemental water.
Well, not just
spirits.
water and elemental spirits. I mean, we're talking about the fact that water does vibrational stuff, frequency. So
Mhm.
whether
Yep.
we're examining it that way, but places of power, Brandon, like you said, could be anything like Göbekli Tepe, the Ove, where the Witch of Endor operated, to
Yeah.
the pyramids
Yeah.
at Giza. I mean, Nikola Tesla honestly believed the pyramids at Giza, the big one, was a power plant of some kind, and that's Nikola Tesla.
I still think
Right.
that. I mean, I do. Just,
Saxe
I mean, the
Woman.
evidence points to it.
Saxe Woman, there's sites in Central America that are massive that people just, I mean, we don't understand. And so we can't really de facto ascribe some kind of something to it, but people have always wanted to be closer to their gods, whatever their gods are. They wanted to make a mountain and have
Yes.
God at the top of the
Yes.
mountain.
Mhm.
So we know that. But places of power,
Well, it's like Augustine said, we all have God-shaped
we all have a
holes, and if
God-shaped
they
hole.
can't find Yahweh, they'll go looking for an idol.
But you can create
Yeah.
a place of power, and that's usually done through ritual, and you can create
Yeah.
holy sacred space. That's a church, right? I mean, you go to some of these churches where
Yes.
real honest holy people have been and prayed, and you can feel it in your spirit.
Yes.
But you can go to places
Yes.
where people have worked with the dark powers, and you can feel it. It's gross, it's disgusting, it feels horrible, but you can feel it.
Yeah.
And so there's facts that, I'm one that believes that the veil isn't a black line. I think that veil is pretty darn thin all over the place.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's there. And you can decide to make your house, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord, or as for me and my house, we can make it a place of dark power. And you can choose that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That's
But
fascinating.
it's chosen by a human.
Yes. Well, that shows the power that God gave us, the authority that God gave us, that He did not give the fallen entities or the sinister forces or even the non-fallen entities that power and authority.
Right.
Mhm. It came
We
to
have it.
it came to me earlier that, man, what if we're ley lines in a sense? What if we're walking ley lines and we're the first territory we need to take back when we come to the Lord, is just this house we have, getting it in order. I don't know. That just kind of came to
Well,
me while we're talking about ley lines.
two things there. Number one, our body is a temple.
Yep.
Okay, and I know that is plural in the Greek, but still, our individual bodies are temples as well
Absolutely.
as a community. The second thing too is I have a friend who's done a lot of work on this. He considers, and I'm not going to get into the details of this, but that our bodies are what he calls prophetic telegraphs.
Mm-hmm.
That we are like, like Tesla balls. We predict in the spirit we can attract or repel spiritual things. So, Lindsay, you really could be onto something there about us being the first house that needs to get in, in order. And yeah, that's true with our open doors, and it's not just open doors. How many burglars just go through an open door? Not many. I mean, burglars go through windows that you don't know about.
Right.
So I get kind of tired of some
This isn't
deliverance
Canada. We lock our
teaching that
doors
says,
around here.
yeah. So anyway, back on, but I would be remiss if I don't mention the fact, and we don't have a lot of time to go into it. Number one, I want to caveat that "Sympathy for the Devil," that Rolling Stone song, was a Process inspired song, and I didn't have time in this podcast to get into the Process
No.
Church, but Lindsey will get into it when he gets
Well, and
gets to
really
his
quick, if
myth
I
and stuff.
could, because I think this
Yeah.
Marianne Faithfull, who was a pretty well-known singer songwriter in
Mhm.
her own right, was dating Mick Jagger, and she was a Process member for a little while. So,
Yep.
And she
See,
did
there it
music
is. Yep.
for Kenneth Anger.
okay, I
Yep.
didn't know that.
Yep.
Yeah.
But the big thing I'm remiss, and we can wrap this up. Crowley was in the intelligence community. Okay, now
No doubt.
that's a urban legend, but I think it's true. I mean, there were several of these characters that were in the intelligence community. And what you have to realize is that people, we get confused. I do that. We get confused with the intelligence community and the military.
Yeah.
Okay. The military is its own entity and it has an intelligence
Mhm.
community, but there are intelligence communities that are public or private intelligence communities that have nothing to do with a nation or military per se. And we need to realize that. So we can say that Crowley was part of the intelligence community, but he was part of the Royal. I can't remember what their MI, it was before it was MI6 or whatever, probably, or yeah. But he was part of the intelligence community, and that just shows you right there how the lines, just like BT said earlier, the line is not a black line; it's a thin line, and not only is it a thin line in the good things, like we talked about the thin spaces of the Celts and stuff like that, but it's a thin line when it comes to evil as well, with the intelligence community and these sinister forces. And I'm not going to say that any movie or show gets it right, but if you really want to understand a lot of that whole dynamic, one of the best shows to watch is Stranger Things on Netflix, to really give you an understanding of the intertwining of the occult with science in the intelligence community. Um, so one more story, and we'll wrap it up. Unless you guys have anything to say, I want to talk a little bit about the OT Solar Lodge, which was actually in the area, and they got kicked out of the area by the infamous Boy in the Box case. Actually, there's two Boy in the Box cases, but this one is the one. This one didn't die. The other one was back east and died, I think. But it was Anthony Saul Gibbons, uh, was the boy,
Yeah.
and he was how Lindsay, you fill us in on that. This is more your wheelhouse. You know about
Oh,
this, don't you?
yeah. Well, he was like 5 or 6 years old. The Solar Lodge kind of claimed lineage from an old OTO group called the Agape Lodge in
Right.
California there. But the Agape Lodge, the OTO, the one later kind of disavowed them. Um, they had moved out to the desert, and one of the kids on the property set something on fire, and to punish him, they put him in kind of this metal box, and he had water, and they let him out to do his chores, but it was very dangerous, and yeah, it
Yeah.
was just
Cruel.
yeah, it was cruel any way you look at it. But yeah, I mean, obviously this happened around the same time as the Manson murders, and in a lot of people's mind, they were a similar group. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, well, and that's going to lead us into the next thing. But I do want to suggest this too. One of BT's episodes he does with Dr. Judd Burton, he talks about these places of power. So I recommend you guys, check out that episode. And has it been released, BT?
Yeah, that was episode 9, From Ancient Curses to Forbidden Knowledge.
Yeah. See, so you want to get a deeper dive into the whole occult aspect of those power places, or I forget the occult word for them. I guess ley lines.
Works.
Check out BT's podcast on that with Dr. Judd,
Truth and
friend
Shadow
of
podcast.
friend of our shows. So anyway, so to land this plane, all this connection between the occult, the sinister forces, the occult, the intelligence community, starting a countercultural movement, which is bigger than music. We just touched on music because, I mean, you guys, that's my thing. Anybody that knows Brandon Spain knows that music's my thing. I mean, Lindsay loves it too, but music, my life is. Sandy and I have joked, and she's going to make something. We're Unrefined Podcast is the mixtape of the fringe world. Okay. So yeah, I know.
Yeah, it works.
So yeah, because we're
It's
so
nice.
out there. But anyway, but music is my thing. But that was only a small portion. And as we continue to journey into Haunted Canyon and the things that make it haunted, we're going to get to the most infamous character yet, and that would be Charlie. And we'll get to him when we get to
Chucky
Lindsey's
Manson.
episode. Y'all have any? Yeah, y'all have any Chucky Manson? That just sounds so wrong. Chucky Manson. Anyway, he's a small doll with a swastika,
dark hair and beard. No,
that's right. He's the
swastika
Chucky's
brother. Oh, anyway, so any other comments? Anything I've left out, you guys? You want to bring in to? If you can keep it within like 1 or 2 minutes, are we good?
No, I just want to say, man, this has been a interesting and fun, if you can call it that, considering the subject matter, one to do the research on, man.
Oh yeah. Yep. Well, and we do want to do this. This is something that is crucial to, and it is part of our mixtape of our fringy podcast. But I do want to give glory to God, and I do want to say that we in no shape, form, or fashion are trying to glorify all this stuff. I mean, it is interesting to dive into and research, but ultimately we want to be armed is to be ready. We want to know our enemy, that the Bible admonishes us to know the wiles and schemes of the devil. And if anything, it helps us, informs us to pray and to intercede and to work together as the body of Christ to occupy till he comes.
Yeah.
No matter what you feel about the end times and the schemes and what's coming and who the beast is and the mark and all that stuff, no matter what you believe, we are admonished to occupy until he comes. And that requires being over the battleground of, like what BT said earlier, of hearts and minds of people. And it all comes down to that one person in front of us, that has been imbibed in this culture that we have, like a fish in water. And so if we can teach anybody out there to be able to make a connection, to be able to have a conversation, and it lead back to spiritual things and lead back to Jesus through our information, then I think we've achieved what we want to do with this podcast. What do you think, guys?
Yeah. I think it's great. I mean, ultimately, could these secrets we're finding in the Haunted Canyon hold some kind of key to unlocking the mysteries of the unknown?
Yes.
Boom.
I mean, to me, I know I've made a big deal about this, and believe me, audience out there, the guys have heard me belabor Laurel Canyon for almost a year now. I'm like, I want to dive into Laurel Canyon. There's just something, and it's more than Laurel Canyon too, you guys. It's the City of Angels. I mean, ironically,
right? The
City of Angels is a hub and definitely a cultural creator for our United States. It really is. It really is. So, well, guys, thank you. I've enjoyed it. I agree with Lindsey, man. It's been fun. It's been enlightening, but it's still fun to have a conversation about this kind of stuff with two dudes who know a lot more about all this than I do. So, I thank you guys for this conversation and our banter, so to speak. So, peace out, you guys. Peace, hope, and love.
Peace.
Thanks for listening and supporting us. And remember, stay naturally supernatural.